There are things we light without thinking. A wick catches flame, wax begins to melt, and we call it warmth, we call it comfort. But history remembers differently. History remembers when that same flame was turned inward, when light became a tool of unimaginable suffering, when something as simple as a candle was transformed into an instrument of death. This is the story of the candle torture, a method so insidious, so psychologically devastating that even its whispers make the air feel colder. The candle sits in countless paintings, religious iconography, medieval manuscripts. It flickers in the background of our oldest memories of humanity. A symbol of hope, of vigil, of prayer. But in the hidden chambers of inquisitors, in the dungeons of warlords, in the interrogation rooms where screams were swallowed by stone walls, the candle meant something else entirely. It meant pain that came drop by drop. It meant terror that could be extended indefinitely. It meant a death so slow, the mind shattered long before the body surrendered. We begin in the European Dark Ages, though this torture method stretched across continents, across cultures, across centuries. The principle was simple, horrifyingly simple. A naked human body restrained, immobilized, arms stretched wide or legs bound tight, and then candles, not one, not two, sometimes dozens, placed strategically on the skin beneath the flesh into orifices. The flame would burn, the wax would drip, and the agony would compound with every passing second. What made this torture particularly sinister was its duality. The flame itself caused immediate, searing pain, degree burns forming almost instantly, skin blistering, peeling, blackening. But the molten wax, superheated to temperatures exceeding 150 degrees, would pour onto exposed flesh, sealing the wounds even as it created new ones. The body couldn't breathe through its burns. The pain couldn't escape. It was trapped, layered, accumulating like sediment at the bottom of a dark ocean. Historians have documented variations of this method across medieval Europe, feudal Japan, ancient Persia, and colonial South America. Each culture adapted it, refined it, made it their own. In some accounts from the Spanish Inquisition, candles were inserted into the victim's mouth, lit, and left to burn downward. The tongue would blister first, then the throat. Breathing became agony, swallowing became impossible. The victim would drown in their own melted flesh and pooling wax, suffocating from the inside while flames consumed them from within. In other documented cases, candles were placed between fingers and toes, lit simultaneously. The small bones would heat, then crack. The joints would swell, then rupture. Nerve endings, so densely packed in the extremities, would fire endlessly, sending shockwaves of pain through the entire nervous system. Some victims went into shock within minutes. Others remained conscious for hours, their minds fracturing under the sustained assault. There's a particular account from 16th century Germany that survives in fragmentary trial records. A woman accused of witchcraft, her name lost to time, was subjected to candle torture for 3 consecutive days. Each session lasted approximately 4 hours. The executioner's notes, cold and clinical, describe the progression. Day 1, candles on the soles of her feet. Day 2, candles arranged along her spine. Day 3, candles placed on her abdomen and chest. She confessed on the second day. But the torture continued because confession wasn't always the goal. Sometimes the cruelty was the point. The psychological dimension of candle torture deserves its own examination. Unlike methods that killed quickly, this was designed to extend suffering. The victim could see the candles being lit, could watch the flame dance, could anticipate the moment the wax would drip. That anticipation, that knowledge of inevitable pain, created a secondary torture within the mind. Time stretched, seconds became eternities. The human psyche, faced with prolonged, inescapable agony, begins to disintegrate. Hallucinations emerge, dissociation occurs. The self splits, trying desperately to escape a body that has become a prison of fire. In feudal Japan, A variation called raso kuzim was documented during the Edo period. Bamboo slivers were inserted under fingernails, then candles were dripped directly onto the insertion points. The heat would travel down the bamboo, conducting thermal energy directly into the nerve clusters beneath the nail bed. Medical experts who have studied historical accounts suggest the pain would have been equivalent to continuous electrocution. The nervous system, overwhelmed, would eventually begin misfiring, causing full-body convulsions even as the victim remained conscious. The question haunts the margins of these historical records: why? Why this method? Why candles? The answer reveals something deeply disturbing about human cruelty. Candles were everywhere, they were cheap, they were replaceable. An executioner could carry dozens, could light them easily, could control the pace of suffering with surgical precision. Add a candle, increase the pain; remove one, offer false hope. The victim could be kept in a state of maximum suffering just below the threshold of death for days, even weeks. There's another dimension worth exploring: the religious and ritualistic aspects. In many inquisitorial proceedings, the use of candles carried symbolic weight. Light was associated with divine truth, with purity, with God's illuminating presence. To use that same light as an instrument of torture created a perverse theological statement. The heretic, the witch, the accused was being purified by holy flame. Their screams were prayers forced from corrupted flesh. Their suffering was atonement. The inquisitors genuinely believed they were saving souls by destroying bodies. Contemporary accounts from observers, rare but revealing, describe the sounds: the hiss of wax meeting flesh, the crackling of burning skin, and beneath it all the screams. Not sudden, sharp screams, but sustained, ragged, deteriorating sounds that started human and ended as something else entirely. Some witnesses reported that after hours of candle torture, victims no longer sounded like people. They sounded like animals caught in traps, or worse, like nothing recognizable at all. The medical aftermath for those who survived was catastrophic: third and fourth degree burns covering substantial portions of the body. Infections were almost guaranteed in pre-modern medicine. Gangrene would set in within days. Sepsis would follow. Even if the physical wounds somehow healed, the psychological scars never did. Post-traumatic stress, though not understood or named in historical periods, manifested in survivors as permanent madness. Many who survived candle torture spent their remaining years in asylums or monasteries, unable to reintegrate into normal life, unable to escape the memory of fire and wax. One particularly detailed account comes from the trial records of the Loudun possessions in 17th century France. A priest, accused of witchcraft and demonic congress, was subjected to a combination of tortures, with candle torture being the primary method. The presiding judge's notes describe the process with disturbing clarity. 73 candles were used over 6 hours, placed on feet, legs, groin, chest, arms, and face. The priest maintained his innocence throughout. He was executed the following morning, but the candle torture had already killed him in every meaningful sense. His body still moved, still breathed, but witnesses reported his eyes were empty. The person was gone. We must also consider the torturers themselves. What does it do to a human mind to inflict such suffering methodically, repeatedly, as part of official duty? Some historical records include confessions from executioners in their final years. One account from an aging Spanish torturer describes nightmares that never stopped. He reported seeing the flames in every shadow, hearing screams in every silence. He died in a monastery, having taken vows of silence and penance, but the records suggest he never spoke another word after confessing his role in candle tortures. The geographical spread of this torture method suggests independent development in multiple cultures. This wasn't a technique that spread through communication or cultural exchange. It was discovered again and again because it relied on a universal human vulnerability, fire, and a universal human tool, the candle. From the Aztec priests who used variations involving ceremonial candles and captives, to Chinese dynasties that employed similar methods during political purges, the fundamental mechanics remained consistent. Flame plus flesh equals suffering. Suffering plus time equals confession, compliance, or death. There's a particular cruelty in the pace of candle torture. A beheading is instantaneous. Hanging, a few minutes. Even breaking on the wheel, brutal as it was, concluded within hours. But candle torture could be calibrated to last as long as the torturer desired. Add candles slowly. Space them precisely. Ensure maximum pain with minimum lethality. Some victims endured sessions lasting multiple days, brought to the edge of death, then allowed to recover just enough to be tortured again. The cumulative psychological destruction was absolute. Documentation from the Ottoman Empire includes accounts of candle torture being used during interrogations of spies and political dissidents. The method was considered particularly effective because it left the victim conscious and capable of speech, even while experiencing maximum pain. Unlike beatings that could cause unconsciousness or waterboarding that interrupted breathing, candle torture allowed for continuous interrogation. The victim could answer questions, provide information, all while flames consumed them inch by inch. The decline of candle torture as a formal method came gradually, tied to Enlightenment reforms and changing attitudes toward judicial punishment. By the late 18th century, most European nations had officially banned torture in legal proceedings. But prohibition on paper didn't mean cessation in practice. Unofficial use continued in prisons, in colonial outposts, in places where oversight was minimal and power was absolute. Even into the 20th century, isolated reports emerge of candle torture being employed in civil wars, in detention centers, in the dark corners where law and morality cease to exist. Modern psychologists who study historical torture methods have analyzed candle torture through the lens of contemporary understanding of pain and trauma. The combination of thermal injury, sustained nerve stimulation, and psychological anticipation creates what's termed total pain syndrome. The body's pain receptors become so overwhelmed they begin sending continuous distress signals, effectively trapping the victim in a permanent state of maximum suffering. The brain, unable to process or adapt, begins to shut down non-essential functions. Memory fragments, time perception collapses, the self dissolves. There's a philosophical question buried in these historical horrors. What does the existence of such methods reveal about human nature? The candle torture wasn't created in a moment of rage or passion. It was developed deliberately, refined through practice, documented in official procedures. People held jobs as professional torturers. They received payment. They went home to families. They lived normal lives in between sessions of inflicting unimaginable suffering. The bureaucratization of cruelty, the normalization of horror, suggests something profoundly disturbing about our capacity for compartmentalization. Archaeological evidence of candle torture is rare but revealing. Excavations of medieval dungeons have uncovered iron restraints positioned at angles consistent with the body positioning described in torture manuals. Residue analysis on some restraints shows traces of beeswax and tallow, the primary components of historical candles. More disturbing are the human remains sometimes found in these locations. Bones showing signs of extreme heat exposure on the surface but not throughout, consistent with external burning rather than cremation. These silent witnesses testify to suffering that transcends historical record. The literary and artistic representations of candle torture, while rare, carry immense psychological weight. Dante's Inferno, with its elaborate descriptions of eternal punishment, includes flames that burn without consuming, pain that persists without end. While not explicitly describing candle torture, the conceptual framework mirrors its horror. Art from the period sometimes depicts martyrs surrounded by flames, their faces serene, but we know the reality was screaming and horror, not peaceful acceptance. The sanitization of torture in religious art serves as another layer of historical distortion. We should examine the legal frameworks that permitted such practices. Torture was not illegal in most historical legal systems. It was, in fact, a recognized and regulated part of judicial procedure. Specific rules governed who could be tortured, under what circumstances, for how long. But these rules existed within systems where the accused had no rights, no representation, no recourse. The regulation of torture didn't make it humane. It simply made it systematic. The candle torture, along with countless other methods, was legal, sanctioned, often encouraged by the highest authorities in church and state. The survivor testimonies that exist, though fragmentary and translated through multiple languages and centuries, carry a consistent tone of dissociation. They describe watching their own suffering from outside themselves. They report feeling as though the body being tortured belonged to someone else. This psychological splitting is now recognized as a defensive mechanism the mind employs when confronted with inescapable trauma. But for historical victims, there was no therapy, no understanding, no framework for processing what had been done to them. They lived with the memories, unfiltered and unhealed, until death provided the only escape. In some cultures, candle torture was combined with other methods, creating layered systems of suffering. In certain Chinese dynastic periods, victims would first be subjected to bamboo torture, then candle torture, then water torture in sequence. Each method targeted different pain pathways, ensuring the body couldn't adapt or numb itself to any single stimulus. The cumulative effect was a complete sensory overload that resulted in permanent psychological destruction, even if the victim eventually survived. The economic aspect of torture methods is rarely discussed but reveals its own darkness. Candle torture was cost-effective. Candles were cheap and abundant. Unlike complex mechanical devices or specialized tools, any jailer could implement it with minimal training or resources. This accessibility meant it could be deployed widely, in small towns and large cities, in wealthy courts and poor villages. The democratization of torture, if such a grotesque phrase can be applied, meant more people suffered, not fewer. Religious reformers who opposed torture often did so not on humanitarian grounds, but on theological ones. They argued that forced confessions were spiritually invalid, that true repentance couldn't be coerced through physical suffering. But these arguments rarely resulted in the abolition of torture. Instead, they sometimes led to even more sophisticated methods designed to break the spirit without leaving physical marks. Psychological torture evolved in parallel with, and sometimes as a response to, critiques of physical torture. The candle torture, however, persisted because it combined both dimensions so effectively. The children of torturers, an often overlooked element of this history, lived with the knowledge of their parents' professions. Some historical records include accounts of sons refusing to inherit their father's positions as executioners or torturers, even when such refusal meant poverty or social ostracism. Other records show dynastic lines of torturers, the craft passed from father to son across generations. What conversations occurred in those households? What justifications were offered? What psychological mechanisms allowed families to function normally while one member spent their working hours inflicting candle torture? Modern attempts to understand historical torture often involve experimental archaeology, careful ethical reconstructions using thermal measurements and pain scale modeling, never involving actual human subjects. These studies confirm what historical accounts suggest. Candle torture would have caused pain levels beyond anything most modern people have experienced. The combination of direct flame exposure and molten wax creates a dual-action thermal injury that maximizes nerve stimulation. Even simulated versions, using temperature sensors and thermal imaging, demonstrate that the pain would have been sustained at maximum levels for the entire duration of the torture. The language used in historical torture manuals is clinical, procedural, devoid of empathy. Instructions for candle torture read like recipes. Place 3 candles on each foot. Wait for the wax to pool before adding candles to the lower legs. Maintain flames for no less than 2 hours. This bureaucratic language served a function. It created psychological distance between the torturer and the act. It transformed suffering into procedure, horror into protocol. Reading these manuals today produces a particular kind of nausea, not from graphic description, but from the casual tone applied to unspeakable acts. Some historians argue that the true death toll from candle torture can never be known. Many victims died weeks or months after the torture from infections, complications, or suicide. These deaths wouldn't be attributed to torture in official records. Others were simply disposed of, their names never recorded, their suffering never documented. The archives hold fragments, glimpses, but the full scope of this horror stretches beyond historical record into the realm of collective trauma that shaped entire populations. The abolition movements that eventually succeeded in banning torture drew heavily on Enlightenment philosophy, on emerging concepts of human rights and dignity. Cesare Beccaria's 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments argued systematically against torture, not just on moral grounds but on practical ones. Torture produced unreliable confessions, corrupted justice, degraded society. But even as laws changed, practice lagged decades behind. The last officially recorded use of judicial torture in Europe occurred in the early 19th century, but unofficial use continued far longer. There's a contemporary resonance to this history that cannot be ignored. The techniques may have evolved, but the fundamental impulse to cause maximum suffering to achieve some end persists in modern contexts. Understanding historical torture methods isn't about satisfying morbid curiosity. It's about recognizing patterns of human cruelty that repeat across time. The candle torture in its specific historical form may be gone, but the psychology that created it, that systematized it, that justified it, remains present in human societies. Vigilance against such impulses requires remembering what we're capable of. The final category of candle torture victims deserves specific mention: the innocents. Children, in some historical accounts, were subjected to candle torture in front of their parents to extract confessions. Parents were tortured in front of children for the same purpose. The deliberate weaponization of familial bonds, the knowledge that one person's suffering could be amplified through another's witness, represents a particular kind of evil that transcends the physical act itself. These psychological scars passed through generations, creating cycles of trauma that continued long after the flames were extinguished. In the end, we're left with silence. The screams have long since faded, the flames are cold, the wax has hardened and crumbled away. But the historical record remains, fragmented and disturbing, a testament to what humans can do to each other when power is absolute and empathy is absent. The candle torture stands as one method among many, but its particular combination of simplicity, availability, and psychological horror makes it emblematic of a darker truth. We create tools for light and warmth, and then we find ways to turn those tools into instruments of suffering. Archives hold these stories not as entertainment, but as warning. Every torture method ever devised came from a human mind, was implemented by human hands, was justified by human systems of belief and power. The distance between civilization and barbarity is not as great as we'd like to believe. It's measured not in centuries but in choices, in the decision to see others as fully human or as objects, in the willingness to inflict suffering or the courage to refuse. The candle still burns in our homes, on our tables, in our ceremonies. Most of us will never think of torture when we light one, and perhaps that's as it should be. But for those who study history, who examine the darker passages of human experience, the candle carries a dual meaning: light and shadow, comfort and horror. The same object, transformed entirely by context and intent. History remembers when we cannot. When the last survivor died, their memories died with them, but the documents remain. The trial records, the torture manuals, the fragmentary testimonies. They speak in whispers across centuries, telling us what was done, how it was done, why it was justified, not to glorify suffering, but to ensure we understand its mechanisms. Knowledge is the only defense against repetition. Some truths are too heavy to carry. Some histories too dark to fully comprehend, but they exist nonetheless, woven into the fabric of human experience. The candle torture is one thread in that fabric, a reminder that progress is not inevitable, that cruelty is not confined to any single culture or era, that vigilance and empathy are constant requirements, not default states. The flame flickers, the wax drips. And somewhere in the archives, in the margins of forgotten documents, in the silence between recorded facts, the memory persists. Not as glory, not as entertainment, but as warning, as witness. As the quiet insistence that we remember what was done so that we might choose differently in whatever darkness lies ahead. History does not forget, even when we desperately wish it would. The shadows remain, patient and permanent, waiting for anyone willing to look directly at what humans have done, and what we remain capable of doing when we turn light into weapon, warmth into agony, and simple tools into instruments of unimaginable suffering. The candle burns. But now you know what else it has burned, and that knowledge, uncomfortable and necessary, is the only memorial these forgotten victims will ever have. Some shadows live in the things we use every day, waiting for us to remember.